welcome to this session. I'd like to introduce myself. I'm Susanne von Itter. I'm the director of the European Association of Development Research and Training Institutes. And welcome to all our speakers. And I'm going to take the mic. So EADI is an association of about 150 institutions working in development research, and our aim is to be an umbrella body and a facilitator and forum for all researchers active in development studies. And we also have individual and student members. In 2018, we initiated a series of panels and forums at international conferences focusing on the production of knowledge. And in this context, I'd like to cite our president, Henning Melba. Like development, knowledge is not neutral, nor is it value-free. We therefore cannot uncritically affirm and praise knowledge production as a relevant aspect of and contribution to development without examining the nature and intention of both, the knowledge created and applied, as well as the concept and meaning of development. In this spirit, I would like to hand over to Julia, who will introduce the session.
Thank you, Susanne, and welcome everyone, especially our panel, but of course everyone. We would like to discuss, as Susanne said, we're concerned with questions of knowledge production, of knowledge co-creation. In the last couple of days we've been discussing transformations and what does a transformative agenda look like that leads to equity, that leads to sustainability for all. And indeed, inequality is the overriding theme of our time. For example, in the 2016 World Social Science Report, it was vividly demonstrated that inequality has many intersecting dimensions. And there are many dynamics to inequalities. Dynamics in terms of economic aspects, of social, of cultural, political, spatial and environmental issues. However, knowledge has the furthest and the far-reaching impact on all of these dimensions. And the report suggests there are wide gaps in terms of which kind of knowledge are produced, by whom and where, and of course whose knowledge or knowledges are counting. So in this session we want to discuss the implications of the understanding and the definitions of knowledge production. And we have a very diverse range of presentations. However, they all deal with the same question. And this question is, how can we build structures for co-creation and co-production of knowledges that involve all stakeholders, not just academia, not just in the global north, that involve stakeholders in research, in practice, in policy, in civil society. And that as we have heard in the last couple of days, that also involve stakeholders in the non-human world. So we are asking, how can foundations be laid to ensure collaborative knowledge building? And we think, talking about collaboration, it makes sense to collaborate also in the presentations and to get into conversation and talk with each other rather than just adhere to PowerPoint presentations. So that's why we like to invite everyone, you, and also the panel, just to engage in conversations about the topics that are presented and the issues that are put forward. So we will have brief interventions by each of the presenters, and then we will invite everyone to put questions forward from the panel, but also from everyone. So I'd like to introduce our first speaker, which is Fukuoka. He comes from Nigeria, from the Obafemi Awolowo University. And he will talk to us about the agency of translations, especially in relation to indigenous knowledge systems and their diffusion into a global ecosystem. So, Olu, please.
Very much. Thank you very much. First things first, I'd like to appreciate the organizers of this panel for inviting me, and by extension, the WSSF for considering me to present at this panel. It was L, I'm from the River South. But thank God I'm here. As we've heard, I'm going to talk about the imperative of translation in evolving a global episteme using indigenous language. And in going about this, I will just draw references from Yoruba origin. By the way, the Yorubas are based in the southwest of Nigeria, and there are about 3 million people, and they are also very present in the diaspora, especially in Brazil and South and Latin America. So I begin, by way of outline, I want to talk about, I'll give you a brief introduction. I'll talk about what I mean by global episteme. And I will question the idea of globalization. I will dwell on indigenous knowledge, or traditional knowledge, or oral tradition. Now I will move to translation as bridge to producing indigenous epistemologies. And then talk about the nature of Yoruba origin, with examples from Yoruba origin. I'll now go into exemplifications of how aspects of Yoruba cultural productions, if when properly translated, can actually yield into a process of forming a desired global episteme. So, the idea of a global episteme that I hint about is about a world that is conscious of the need for all to bring something on the table in a bid to solving problems of existence. In other words, I mean that if we are talking about earthquakes in Japan, you can also talk about flooding in southern Nigeria, or erosion in other parts of the world. These are all natural disasters. For this to be located in indigenous epistemology means that each and every one coming from different points of the globe should be able to offer to say something about this menace or this issue. So the whole idea of global episteme that I talk about unifies humanity and hints towards a common humanity. Now, when we talk about globalization, I think, for me, globalization would have served the purpose of trying to evolve a global episteme, but it has come with ups and downs, it comes with its challenges. There's no doubt in the fact that globalization has, come down from the global north to the global south. This in itself makes it almost inappropriate to capture the idea of a global episteme. In other words, globalization, if it will be functional, if it will be useful to the idea of a global episteme, must be integrated and made to contextualize into certain special, concretizations. Now, the whole idea of indigenous knowledge. The whole idea of indigenous knowledge simply means that there were non-logocentric cultures, non-logocentric ideas of grappling or understanding the world. These were expressed through several myths, and these were produced through various cultural productions across all human societies and civilizations. I was not surprised to see the structure of the Japanese empire. It is similar to what you had in the old empire in Nigeria or even the British monarchy. So this tells us that societies had existed and they had fashioned out ways of producing knowledge, ensuring it is diffused and ensuring its proper utilization for common good. Now, the whole idea of translation as bridge. I propose in my talk now that it is good enough to say that there are samples and robust evidence of knowledge in indigenous societies. But the question is, how do we integrate this modicum of knowledge into the global episteme? This is where translation comes in. In literary practice, translation can take the form of transliteration, can take the form of text-to-text illustration. But the translation I'm talking about now has to do with a total or a holistic cultural experience, which signposts the fact that for someone to translate a cultural ideology or a cultural epistemology, there must be a competence as a natural or indigenous translator, someone who is au fait with the culture of the idea is trying to project. So, if translation therefore comes across in a robust way, it makes it easier to achieve this idea of a global episteme based on a properly harnessed translation mechanism. Now, I will now go into samples from Yoruba cultural forms. I will use just proverbs. Among the Yoruba of southwestern Nigeria and in their diasporas, proverbs and religious law are the most central. This was because they appear to be the easiest forms of cultural production to transmit across generations through verbal mechanisms. And also because of their dynamism. Proverbs are not static, can be produced as more and more experiences are grappled. So, when I look at translation now within cultural experiences, I can now look at, briefly, I can look at the issue of food security. The question is, what is the location of the idea of food security in Yoruba origin? So let me give you examples of proverbs that point to the need and imperative for food security. For example, the first one says that this is translated now in the translation I'm advocating, poverty. Okay? The real challenge of poverty is hunger. It's not the same thing as saying the real translation, the transliteration will have been when food leaves poverty, then there's no poverty. Okay? But power translation that takes into consideration the context and the cultural base of the production will tell you simply that the central idea of poverty is hunger. It's the most important aspect of poverty. I go to another one. The transliteration or direct translation will be when somebody is hungry, you cannot talk to the person. Okay? But in the real translation that I'm advocating for integration, what this proverb simply says is that hunger is the bridge towards learning, towards acquisition of knowledge. Okay? I go to another example. This one is a little bit critical. Now, ego is ego. The translation, the direct translation is the ego does not hunger forever. Okay? But the whole idea is this. In real translation, it will be hunger does not last forever. Okay? There are two different things. Hunger does not last forever. That assumes that certain things will be put in place to engage hunger. Another example is this is a little bit post-proverbial. And I've used this example because of my little experience coming here. When someone is hungry, pali in this way is like a euphemism for passport. Okay? So the proverb says, it's a contemporary proverb, it says that when someone is hungry, the next thing is not to think about passport. In other words, passport in this way is the metaphor of elitism. Okay? The person that is hungry, a pauper that is hungry, does not think about flying to Japan. He wants to eat. Okay? Give another example. These are just on food security. I can go on and on different thematics. I think I illustrated another one now. You can look at security generally. And I will round up with that. A proverb says, the translation, the direct translation is that when you are protected, the city is protected. Whereas in the proper translation, if you get it in context, It will say it takes someone who can protect himself to protect the city. It takes someone who can protect his family to protect the city. Okay? In other words, security begins from the self. That is the way transition can be ingrained to really justify a process of knowledge production. The last one, I see Julia looking at this Aristotle. The last one is Adie Balokun, Ara Olokun, Ara Oro Adie. The transition is this: when the N falls on a line, neither the N nor the line enjoy stability. Okay, it's cultural, because in our part of the world, there are lines to spread your clothes. Okay, and chickens or hens, they are part and parcel of our existence, because they are actually the ones that wake you up in the morning, do their wings, they perch on the lines, the clothing lines, where you spread your clothes. But because the hen is staying on the lines, there will not be balance. In other words, if somebody is fomenting trouble, okay, neither him or her nor the target will know peace. The last thing is the death that kills a partner is giving a hint. That is the translation, direct translation. But what we are in here, what he's saying is that the whole idea of security is communal. Okay? Do not say because your neighbor is affected, you are not affected. Remember that your neighbor could be affected, you could also be affected. So what have I been saying? I'm saying that beyond mere translations, it is possible to root translation properly in cultural experiences to enhance indigenous epistemology. This, in a way, ultimately guarantees a global episteme which takes into consideration perspectives from all sources, which will be integrated into the contemporary and which will guarantee that societies contribute to the knowledge production process. Thank you very much for listening to me.
Thank you very much. My name is Sonja Gansefort, and I have the honor to interview Olina for his very interesting paper. And actually, in preparation, reading the abstract, I had prepared a question about the difference between translation and interpretation. And I think this was one of the main points, actually, of your talk now, that it is very important to have this cultural background and in order to have a real interpretation of the knowledges that are there. I'm wondering now, who are the people who are interpreting or translating these knowledges? And is there an ongoing communication now, for example, between development practitioners and Yoruba people? And also, because you said translation is like a bridge, is the communication also going the other way? So knowledges that are coming from outside, are they being translated back into Yoruba language, or is this whole conversation only taking place in French or English?
Thank you. I have another project that actually answers your question. UNESCO, for example, and other arms of the UN organs have prioritized TK, traditional knowledge, or IKS, indigenous knowledge systems, over time. It is not supposed to be a one-way thing. It's supposed to be either way. Okay? Because the way you could be a global citizen, if there's anything like that, is to be able to actually harness knowledge coming from you and coming from elsewhere. That is number one. There is a concept of hybridization. And that hybridization concept actually speaks to the fact that both traditional knowledge and, for example, scientific knowledge are very, very vital in engaging issues. The project I referred to is on climate change. We have discovered that apart from the global north, where, well, it is easier to calculate climate change discourses through direct communication, through elitist communication. There are still challenges, okay, of making the message of climate change, okay, register. So this is what some colleagues and I from several parts from Asia, from some from Southern Africa are working on a project, from Beari System Brown University. So the idea is to, how do you cascade climate change knowledge? The easiest way to do it is to hybridize knowledge. Take climate change knowledge as of your, look at indigenous perspectives on climate change, evolve a whole to engage the issues. And I hope I've answered the question.
Should I go on with my questions, or does anyone else want to jump in the conversation?
Maybe also if anyone else. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Well, I don't really thank you for the opportunity. My name is Daniel, and I'm a faculty from Ghana University of Cape Coast. Yes, I just have just a little bit, I don't know whether it's a question, but I very much align with the discussant's question about who is translating this, and then to what purpose. So, would you also say that at least misinterpretation could also lead to negative epistemologies? For example, the proverb that you talked about regarding a man that is hungry does not need a passport, for example, could also be misinterpreted to be several things. Because the passport you were talking about, you interpreted it to mean that that doesn't need maybe as in any for want of a better, I'm not getting it. But I was also thinking that it could mean that the man will not want to follow any laid down proper rules and bureaucratic procedures in order to achieving the means. The laid down societal goals in order to achieving the means. That could also be misinterpreted to mean violence. So, for example, the Yoruba proverb also that talks about when a man has a sexual drive, doesn't even know the mother that gave birth to it. That is when the penis, I write on sex. So the penis that has erected does not know the mother that has given birth to it. Could also lead to issues about violence against women and things like this. So how do you situate discussions about interpretations of indigenous language and proverbs that may not also constitute negative research methodologies and design? Thank you.
Thank you very much, my brother, my neighbor.
Yeah, neighbor.
You have actually made the point of my point.
Okay.
The point of my point is that translation that is not contextualized is likely to be a victim of misinterpretation. I don't know if it happens in Ghana. Passport issuance and collection, international passport issuance and collection, it's like a racket in my part of the world. And it's assumed that for someone to say the next thing on my agenda is to go and obtain a passport and subject himself to all the vagaries and the extortions that may be involved, that person may be a little bit elitist, or that person may be looking for tourism, or that person may be coming to Japan for this conference. The average man's needs does not extend to getting a passport. So that's Pali, it's called Pali. Of course, I like the extended metaphors you have introduced. The idea of non-conformism. Okay, if someone is hungry. So that is the whole point. That's the whole point. I met a colleague in Ghana, in Johannesburg, from Ghana. He's working on music, popular Ghanaian music. And he did an excellent, fantastic job of relating these things to the issues of, slavery and the slave trade, and proved to us at that conference that it is only in the popular music and not even in the proverbs that there are retentions of the memories of slavery. The point I'm making is that those cultural expressions have a way, of building into, an evolving or a progressing epistemology. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Daniel, and also thanks, Olu. I think we will have more time also to maybe discuss about the question that lots of knowledge just gets transmitted in only the colonial languages, and I think that's also the point you very validly made there. I'd like to move on to Sonja. Sonja Gansefort is based at the German Institute for Japanese Studies in Tokyo, and she will talk to us about power and knowledge production, in particular in international donor practices, and she asks whose truths are valid. That's the most essential point, I think. And she will give some examples from Japanese projects in the Jordan Valley. So, Sonja.
Thank you very much. I will jump right in and apologize for kind of clinging to the script because of the time constraints. So since the Oslo peace process in the 1990s, Palestine has attracted intense attention from international development agencies, and the Palestinian economy and the viability of its proto-state institutions have become extremely dependent on foreign aid. And of course Japan could not be missing from this global arena, so the Japanese Corridor for Peace and Prosperity in the Jordan Valley aims to promote export-led industrial development and foreign investments through the establishment of an agro-industrial border park, which is close to Jericho. You're probably not that familiar with Palestinian geographics, but this is in the West Bank. Conceptualized as a joint project with Japanese, Palestinian, Israeli and Jordanian partners, it is even intended to further regional peace and understanding via economic cooperation. The first project plans were announced in 2006, and after many postponements, physical work finally started in 2012, and as of 2018 there are now 12 tenant companies that have recently started their operations there. From the very beginning it was a very contentious project, and the most vocal critics from the Palestinian activist movement Stop the Wall campaign even came to Japan in 2007 to protest these plans. Contested issues ranged from persistent controversies over logistic details to fundamental challenges to the logic of development and economic cooperation. And I will look at how the meaning of these politically charged concepts such as development, security and peace are negotiated by stakeholders from very different positions. I think the question of power and knowledge production is especially crucial here because the critical positions towards established certainties are regularly dismissed or even shunned in large parts of the international community. I draw on a body of literature called PostDevelopment Theories. They postulate very shortly that development has become a hegemonic discourse in the 20th century that allows control over countries and peoples conceived as underdeveloped and therefore in need of salvation by Western technology and expertise. And in the Palestinian territories, the developmental economic models and policies that are propagated are very much in line with a kind of global mainstream, but there are certain dilemmas of international development cooperation that are, I think, exacerbated by particular political and administrative problems here. For example, the extreme on food imports and the precarious water supply, especially in the Jordan Valley, and the lack of planning certainty because of all the obstacles due to the occupation and the closure, make it a very risky plan to promote this export-oriented production of water-intensive so-called cash crops to be processed and packed in the industrial park. It kind of ignores the main problems I think that we encounter in the Palestinian territories due to political problems. Moving from development towards security, Palestinian territories are often painted as areas of insecurity, terror and danger that must be brought under control. And cooperative industrial parks can in a way be seen as part of such a security architecture. So for once, Palestinian commuter work in Israel and the Israeli settlements is very common. It's of course a cheap source of labor and a major source of income for the Palestinians on the other side. But Palestinian workers are increasingly seen as a security risk because there have been terrorist attacks, and now just individuals go around and pull out a knife and attack someone, right? So critics now suspect that the border parks will mainly serve to contain Palestinian labor in easily controlled and securitized development zones outside Israeli territory or Jerusalem, allowing for their continued exploitation while closing the borders and enforcing the separation of populations that has been going on since the Oslo Accords. Special work permits and passes, for example, are now being discussed as a way to facilitate the workers' access to the industrial park and let them pass easier through checkpoints, which would be a very clear advantage over other production sites, but at the same time it doesn't really enforce a universal right to mobility, but rather just distributes privileges within the occupational framework. Concerning the movement of goods, there is a system in the Palestinian territories called the back-to-back system, where goods have to be unloaded and reloaded pallet by pallet from Palestinian to Israeli trucks at any border crossing for security checks. And this process is of course very lengthy, very costly, and it's very damaging to agricultural products, as you can imagine. So one idea is to install modern scanners in the checkpoints for containers to make this process faster and easier. And there have been some cases where aid or the ODA money was actually used to install these scanners. But critics, of course, contend that modernizing checkpoints using aid money de facto recognizes the Israeli occupation and helps to maintain and cement the closure. And anyways, I think in the current political situation, it remains rather questionable whether these technical improvements can indeed secure stable access and promote exports as is planned in the Japanese project. So from the experiences that were made so far, when modernized scanners were installed, it just added another layer of security checks to the existing system, while the back-to-back system was still being walked through afterwards. Up to the last concept of peace. Now, many projects in Palestine contain the word peace in their name, because there is so little peace, I guess. And a common rationale for aid is to further the peace process by alleviating economic hardships and by providing some economic incentives for cooperation and by establishing trust between the conflicting parties through cooperative economic projects. So they say, if they can make money, they will just stop making war instead. But on the Palestinian side, there's a strong counter-discourse rejecting this apolitical normalization, as it's called, or tatbiya in Arabic, normalization of relations with the Israeli side before reaching a solution to the ongoing conflict. And the proponents of this tatbiya criticism do not necessarily refuse any dialogue with Israeli citizens per se, but they reject the presumption that the conflict is rooted in a lack of communication between two equally strong parties. So they say, if we only look for the roots of the conflict in an irrational lack of trust, rather than in political issues such as the control over land and resources or sovereignty and extreme inequality, this would only lead to the depoliticization and the prolongation of the conflict in the end. Now, criticizing this discourse of economic cooperation is often discredited as rejecting peace in general, or even as terrorism or anti-Semitism. And critics that are using this Totbiya language, or that are speaking of Israeli colonies instead of settlements, as has become very common among Palestinian political movements in recent years, they are often perceived as being too radical, and they're excluded from discussion, for example, by the Japanese embassy and the aid agencies. And besides these fundamental criticisms, Japanese developers also faced numerous small-scale hassles. So, in this case, every infrastructural detail and every organizational decision became very political and sensitive. For example, the construction of new roads in the West Bank runs the risk of allowing the blockade of existing roads for Palestinians and just leaving them for the exclusive usage of the settlers. And the modernization of checkpoints is another case in point. At the same time, the Palestinian side, of course, is also trying to leverage development projects to enforce their own claims. For example, trying to recategorize the building land for the industrial park, which was in Israeli-controlled Area C. You're probably not that familiar with the areas after the Oslo Accords, but this is an area that is controlled by the Israeli military, and they wanted to have it recategorized as shared Area B. Another endeavor was to push to reopen another border crossing for the export of agricultural products of the agricultural park, but all these attempts have failed so far. And the local population had little say in these decisions. Local community leaders in the Jordan Valley were asked for their opinions by JICA staff. Of course, this is a part of the protocol, but their protests didn't have any impact, they said. And another group whose interests were particularly affected by the selection of the building land didn't even have a voice or any rights. And it was only during one interview that it incidentally transpired that there was some informal usage of the supposedly empty building land after all. There were some farmers using this land. Well, they were not heard, but groups such as the Stop the Wall campaign, they do articulate their protest audibly enough to cause irritation also on the Japanese side, but their criticism doesn't seem to have any influence on the project after all. So dissenting knowledge is often discredited, disregarded, or co-opted in inconclusive stakeholder consultations.
So we're two presenting our own paper, so we were asked both to ask, or to play this role of a discussant. So we maybe ask two questions immediately, and then you answer whichever one you like, or none, or both, if you're really good. I don't think we're playing good cop, by the way. We'll try to be good cops. Okay, I'm trying to think about this in terms of somebody who's not a researcher, but who's interested in the issues you're talking about. What are the many policy challenges basically that you listed? You know, there's a pile of them. You know, that goes from access to work or right to work for Palestinians to security to which one would you pick as one that you feel your research has actually contributed to in terms of its understanding? I'm not asking for solutions. I don't think it's fair to ask for solutions to somebody who's doing social science, and I think that's not the role of a social scientist. It would be actually unfair, I think. But is it the inclusivity of the design of aid interventions, for example, in an area, the inclusiveness of this kind of design of aid interventions, or is it something else? Which one is the policy challenge that you think you have really something to say that could interest people working on this?
Yeah, and in fact it looks like I'm going to ask a question that is related to that. I think I listened to one of the very specific examples you gave in your paper, which is this issue that essentially the Japanese aid agency didn't fully realize that this land was used for other purposes that they had realized. And I think my question is about essentially the theoretical framework you apply in your paper to analyze the situation. Is it fundamentally a macro framework that analyzes the power structure at the macro level and leads you to this conclusion that essentially the power structure is such that there cannot be a fair deal around these special industry zones or whatever they're called? Or do you think it can also work as a micro framework to understand specific power relations, such as this issue of these farmers' right to be understood, and to allow an organization like the Japanese aid agency to identify stakeholders that are relevant in the story?
Thank you very much. I will try to answer both questions. First of all, where do I contribute? This is also always, of course, the question we have to ask ourselves, and I don't think I have solutions, of course. Well, I think one of the main problems I see with this project is that there's a lot of activism, of things that have to be done. The project was blown up very much, so I think it was more a thing that happened on paper than in reality, even though in reality it also happened, so in the end the farmers cannot use the land anymore and something is going on, but it's probably not going to have a huge effect either on the Palestinian economy nor on the political situation and whatnot. And I think my appeal will be to not only include the critical voices in the planning of projects per se, but also to ask the fundamental question whether we really need any kinds of these projects or whether we don't need a completely different kind of action, which is political pressure and influence to try to solve the situation instead of making up very glorious projects that don't really have any beneficial effects in the end. For example, the International Red Cross has stopped their aid activities in the Palestinian situation because they said we cannot bear responsibility for this anymore. We are not really making a good contribution in this situation anymore. And there are a couple of NGOs that are calling for an aid boycott in Palestine. So, considering that now a large part of the Palestinian population probably is working for NGOs and international aid organizations, this would also be very critical, and of course parts of the population depend on food aid, etc. So we cannot just stop that and let everyone starve just to find a solution. But I think I would call for a very basic and fundamental rethinking of these development policies. And concerning the second question and whether this is a macro approach or a micro approach, now I'm sure it sounded very macro what I just said, but I don't really see this as focused on one level only. So I think it very much goes down to the very micro level where, of course, I don't think any development project probably considers the illegal, informal usage of land in this case, but I think it is still very important to point out that there are people that are in very powerless situations and that are being disempowered even more by this project. Sorry, I talked too long.
Julia, you want us to open the floor to the room?
Yeah. Oh, sorry. Are there?
Hi, I'm Andreas. Originally from Austria, but I work in South Africa, the Human Science Research Council. Thanks very much for the presentation and talk. You mentioned at the end that there's a resistance of different knowledges there, not dissonant knowledge, that they're not really being incorporated in the development machine. How would you be able to incorporate them better? have you any ideas of how can those voices that are outside of their formal spaces of development being brought into? I mean, there is the idea of anti-politics, the criticism of development. There is a huge literature behind it, and there are, I mean, loud voices, criticizing. Why is it still so difficult for those voices to be integrated and included?
Thank you. Yeah, this is of course a very fundamental problem, and in this case, I think there were some really good attempts to make the voices heard, like the speaking tour in Japan. Some of these actors, together with the workers' unions and some other actors and academics, have all even organized a conference on industrial parks, for example, in Jerusalem. They are in line with many political forces, I would say, in Palestine and Israel that are critical of also the two-state solution, and they are supporting the BDS movements, which are excluded, I think, in many ways because they are perceived as too critical. And well, I don't know what they could do better to be heard, because I think they did really commendable efforts to make their points, but in the end, I guess this was not the goal of the policies, the Japanese policies. They didn't really want to get involved in all this mess, and didn't want a political project, but just a visible, nice peace project to be visible on the stage. And yeah, I don't really have an answer how to do that.
Yeah, unfortunately, I think we have to move on. But I think the point you're making about the depoliticization or the politicization of development also adds up very well what Susanne said in the beginning, that development is not neutral. And also what Olu put forward, that obviously everyone needs to bring something to the table. I really liked what Francesco said, basically already introducing yourself, saying you are not a researcher, and I think it's good that we have non-researchers in the conversation too, rather than having always the ivory tower of academia. So I'd like to introduce Gilles Duboucher and Francesco Urbino. Francesco is from the Global Development Network, and Gilles belongs to Ideas Belong. They will be presenting on research practice networks, which is really important, as I said, to avoid the ivory tower. Are presenting it as a format for a more inclusive approach to knowledge production. And of course, and again adding to what Olu already put forward, for more inclusive north-south, but also south-south knowledge co-creation. So I'm looking forward to your presentation.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So thanks, of course, for the organizers for accepting our abstract is always nice. We decided to run a bit with the idea of following a bit of an unorthodox format, so we'll build a dialogue between the two of us. Hopefully that will be easy for everybody else to jump in. Okay, let's start with why we are here, really. So I work for the Global Development Network, so I have a background, I'm a trained social scientist, if you like, but so we are both, and actually Gilles is a computer scientist, so we're two people trained in research, but outside, who are now outside of the ivory tower, if you like. So the Global Development Network supports social sciences in developing countries. And one way we do that is to manage research programs. And so we work with developing country social scientists to work on policy-relevant, or what we call policy-relevant research.
Yeah, and I'm Gilles. As Julia said, I'm from Ideas Belong. What is Ideas Belong? I think the starting point, and I hope we all share that here in this room, is that really the challenges of sustainable development call for solutions that can really only emerge from collaboration between research practice and policy, what we call multi-stakeholder collaboration. And the truth is that this kind of collaboration just doesn't happen by accident. What we try to do in Ideas Belong is to develop the actual tools and skills that help make this kind of multi-stakeholder collaborations really a routine practice in organizations like GDN and other organizations. I come more from an institutional background, but we are definitely trying to look at more flexible ideas, which is what I think we're talking about here.
Absolutely. And so the perspective I basically try to bring with this reflection paper is that of somebody who's involved at the funding end and the management end of the program. You know, I think we all agree that that is a critical part of making research equitable. And of course, we take a critical look at the way we work. But looking at this specific angle of how, say, GDN runs its own funding allows us to look at two different questions at the same time, which are key, I think, to the question of equity. One is who is producing this knowledge, so you know, who's involved, and how this knowledge is produced. And I think we will answer the question of production of knowledge, equitable production of knowledge for more equitable kind of outcomes, only if we look at these two questions together. So the second question, of course, would be not only why we're here, but why we're here together. And why we're here together is because we worked on a small, very interesting project which is called PancaNet, which was the Pacific Network, Pacific National Capital Accounting Network. The idea, in a nutshell, was to design a factory of projects, of research projects, on the link between development and environment. So how we create this factory of projects, and we wanted to do that by involving in this factory of projects, of research projects, a wide number of stakeholders, right? You know, differed in terms of sectors, so research, practice, policy, very inclusive definitions. I'm not trying to push categories out. In terms of geographical location, so we're talking about the Pacific region specifically, but across, you know, all the states, island states in the Pacific, plus the Philippines, and across different levels. Local level, so including NGOs looking at the local level, national policymakers, regional organizations, and international organizations such as the World Bank and the UN. So this project PancaNet was really an experiment in having these people work together and build together actual research projects that could look at the link between environment and development. And I guess we should say something about the form.
Yeah. So, as Francesco, as you just said, we wanted to create a factory for projects involving a large number of stakeholders. So, we worked on this vision of research practice network, which Julia introduced us with, which, if you want, is the networked version of a project factory. It's about creating very specific outcomes, which are projects, proposals that can be funded, but in the form of a network that can engage a lot of different stakeholders. So, in a sense, it's quite different from a traditional network, which goal really is the collaboration in itself. An RPN, we define it as one where the collaboration, if you want, is a tool that allows to reach the ultimate goal, which are the actual project proposals that can then be produced. The other aspect, which was very important in RPN, the way we conceived it, is that because we knew from the start that simply getting this conversation into place would not lead to project in itself. There needs to be a push, there needs to be some support. And so right from the start, we imagined the notion that we needed facilitation in these networks. It wouldn't be a passive network where people speak, it would be a network where an actor, specifically GDN, would actually promote the collaboration and become a stakeholder as a bridge builder in the network.
So, what were you trying to achieve? I mean, the pretext to actually start this project was quite simple. In the region, there's something that, for those who were at the plenary last night, heard of, it's called National Capital Accounting. It's basically a quite new set of statistics that just looks at the stocks and the flows of national resources. So there's this whole new set of statistics which was being developed, pushed by international agencies in the Pacific region. But of course, statistics as such cannot be really, are not very useful to policymakers. So the idea is how do we push the use of these statistics? So how do we create a situation where these groups manage to find projects that interrogate the statistics to answer development questions that they had? And the interest went in very different ways. Some people were interested in health, some people were interested in energy, the link between the so-called blue economy, ocean economy, and the depletion of natural resources. And what we had in mind is that to link the people at the question about development, policy actors, civil society, etc., with the data that was coming out from the statistical offices, researchers could play a huge role as a connecting tissue between the two, turning the policy question into a research question that then extracted meaning and information out of the statistics.
And to do that, we really focused on essentially the co-creation between these social scientists, policymakers, actors from the big international funding organizations and international structures such as the World Bank and UNESCO, who were quite interested in the project right from the start. And so this co-creation, the way it happened in practice is that we started actually with a very traditional format. You had already set up, when I joined the project, a meeting which took place in Brisbane in March 2017, where you invited the main stakeholders to speak about NCA use. And I think this really allowed to identify and to some degree mobilize the usual suspects in the field, but at this point we were really missing other actors. Where the design of this research practice network really diverged from what you were used to do is that after that we actually added an online platform on which the participants of the conference could come to continue the thematic discussions of the workshop, specifically in groups that were targeted around specific outcomes, specific domains where we expected, or where they expected, potential projects to come out. You mentioned a few before. And so if you want these thematic discussion groups on the online platforms, where within this network, the factories where the projects could emerge. And this is where GDN, and especially Pierre Bertrand, the third author of this paper, who unfortunately couldn't join us here today, really took a very important role. He knows NCA, neither of us does, so don't ask us questions about that. But he really was able to not just get people to talk, but actually to work with stakeholders to identify potential projects and bring them together. And then the idea is that out of these factories would come projects that would then be presented to notably the World Bank, UNESCO, as I was talking before, which were interested.
Yeah, exactly. One of the interesting things was that we're not self-endowed, but it was a way to help groups of people interested in the same topic to develop a very solid research proposal that then would have the stamp of quality of this initiative, including GDNs, etc., and then could enter a kind of a marketplace by invitation, if you like, where then research donors committed to kind of this kind of research could just pick and shop, if you like, using very in terms for social scientists, including myself, but you see the idea, right?
So did it work, Francesco? That's the real question.
Well, did it work? It worked and it didn't, yeah? So the question, I think it's good to go beyond the question, the binary, yes it did, success, not failure kind of thing. I think we learn an awful lot about what it takes to engineer this kind of collaborations. One thing was very clear, there was a huge demand for this. So
we had much more people who signed up on this platform than we imagined.
Yeah, much beyond the number of people who were invited in Brisbane. So we expanded much beyond the usual suspects. And everybody was very excited, and really expectations were very high. One thing which, one group, surprisingly, which proved not to be ready to be part of this when it came to building the research projects, were researchers themselves. And this is something that we understood later. Some of them were, the field in their own specific disciplines was not developed enough. It was like too much of a niche or a new issue for them to invest time in this. And actually, there are so few researchers in the Pacific area, because everybody just flies to North America, Australia, etc. But they're actually overcommitted, including working as consultants for international organizations, etc. So there are very few people, and those whoever did not necessarily see the value in investing. So this is part of what we learned, but there's much more actually.
Yeah, and I think, one big success for me in this project is that right from the start we had imagined it as a learning experience. This was about testing ideas, about testing models to get collaboration to work. And I think for that, it really worked very well. We have learned a lot of things, and I think one of the big take-home messages that I have is that for a project like that, if you want to be the facilitator, so if you want to be a stakeholder in the conversation, you need to have a very good understanding of the context you're putting your feet in. And I think this really resonates with what you were saying about translation in a way. We should have had more time to do some detailed mapping and understand especially the level of readiness of stakeholders, which would have allowed us, I think, to understand the level of readiness of researchers at this point. And I think it would have helped also for a lot of other things.
As facilitators, the people who were behind the machine, if you like, we realized that understanding exactly what each group was after was of course key. So understanding incentives. And incentives in each of these groups, the civil society, the researchers, the policymakers at different levels, everybody at a different hook, and everybody at a different reason why they were in it. And this is, for researchers, is something that we hadn't fully grasped because the initial response from them was so enthusiastic that we just took them for granted, frankly, right? And because we had a history of collaborating with them as GDN as well. So incentives, key. And that comes out of the mapping. And that is also key to, going back to the actual management of something like this, the facilitation. Facilitation is absolutely key. These are not things that come natural, not things that come automatically. These are people with different worldviews, ways of working, incentive structure, we're all structured within various institutions. So moderation is key. An example is, for example, we asked the groups that were forming around specific topics, say health and environment, to come up as they developed into kind of a closer tight-knit community to draft a mission statement, a joint mission statement. So the role of the moderator, the exercise we used was, drawing from the negotiation, from the diplomatic praxis, a negotiation where they had to actually come up with a text that everybody agreed on. And in that case, the moderator had a key role in building trust, keeping track of everybody's incentives, making sure that nobody was excluded deliberately or by accident. So that the moderator has a key role, and it's a professional role, it's a highly skilled role, and it's something that we need to invest much more energies in. Okay, almost true. Yes, I think that was learning, mapping, incentives and moderation were the key things that we focused on. Now, I guess the question is whether we feel more optimistic about this or less optimistic about this than before we started. Gilles, do you think?
Yeah, well, as I said in the introduction, I work in research practice collaboration for a while, but in much more institutional settings. So this very structured setting was new for me. But I think, in terms of optimism, what I realize is just the need for that. It's so obvious. There is so much need to be able to better create this kind of projects in a way that really engages stakeholders. So the demand is there. The fact that we had so much interest of people signing up on the platform, it was obvious that we need to be able to do that. And I think the other part where I'm actually quite optimistic is that there was a lot we learned, and I feel we are much more prepared to go on with this kind of projects in the future. Yeah, and you?
Yeah, well, for somebody who is in an organization that runs and fundraises for research programs, I'm also kind of optimistic in the sense that we learned a lot, very concrete things that we can focus on. At the same time, I'm wary of the fact that this will require much more collaboration with actors that specialize in specific things.
Structural changes. Really.
Yeah. I do structural changes that have to do with the way organizations like GDN work, but there are some things that GDN will not be able to do. So, for example, moderation is a perfect example. We're not going to develop necessarily kind of a unit looking at moderation. We don't have the capacities to do that. So collaboration between different actors, I think, actually the emergence of new institutions as well probably is the way forward. Thank you.
Thank you.
for that very interesting and reflective paper, where you very frankly come up with the shortcomings of the effort you made and drawn lessons from it. The message I get from the lesson that you draw, and that's where I'd like to look more, is at two dimensions. One, what are the motivations for people to become part of research and practice network like this one? And the second, what are the enabling conditions for this to happen? And for those who want to participate and activate, how does one allow for conditions to do that? For us to be able to understand that better from the effort that you made, one question I had in mind was, who are the champions? As you said, it's the moderator who really played a major role. So three sets of actors that one can see here are the, what you've called the NGO, the public researchers and in public institutions, and the policymakers at the national level. These seem to be the three broad entities.
Yeah, and policymakers at the international level and at international researchers.
Yeah. The sort of blocks seem to have been at the national and local level. So the international, the interests there, and they would have been, but they're sort of taking a backseat, allowing the local processes to occur. Now, in that, and as you said, the initial exercise of mapping who all are there in the field and what is the context seems to be critical for any future efforts that will happen. What is the process that you envisage for that? To identify who is there in the field and then to sort of assign them roles as moderators of this process. Because there is a lot of transdisciplinary research literature on this kind of thing, and a lot of examples now in literature on efforts which have been made and methodologies that have been developed to identify something like, for example, I can think of the we use, which is the participatory impact pathways assessment. A paper exercise where you sit down and actually say, okay, the objective is a factory of projects, as you call it. Then, what are the barriers that we are likely to find? Who are the ones who can facilitate through the barriers? And actually think through that process. And in that, therefore, what is the role of what you've called NGOs? NGOs, I don't know about the Pacific, but if I look at it from the South Asia or the India end, I can identify that NGOs is not a homogeneous bag. There's a whole range. There's from the think tank with researchers in them to the ones who are actually working with the communities and therefore can give us that end. And in this context of natural capital accounting, what I can think of is those who are invested with environmental issues. And I have been probably working on them well before we knew the word sustainability and so on, would be the ones who would really be invested in trying to see that the NCA works. What is the kind of role you saw for them in a process like this? So that's sort of one question. The second about motivation.
Maybe I think maybe just the one.
Yeah, maybe I'll start the answer and then I'll pass it over to Francesco. I think your point about engaging the NGOs is very important here, because it's true that typically there exists networks connecting NGOs and researchers on specific projects. That's something we're very aware. And I think this is an area where we could have really used these as these pre-existing networks as stakeholders to be engaged in the project. On the other hand, I think it's important to understand that we are trying to do something that is actually slightly beyond what happens usually. We know how to create networks of research practice networks where the researchers and the practitioners already form a pre-existing community. The challenge here is that we are trying to create research practice policy collaboration around networks where there is no pre-existing community. And that, I think, is really the challenge that we're trying to solve here. But I think what I want to say is that you are right that using these communities more and better understanding them is absolutely crucial. At the same time, they become one stakeholder in the conversation. They are not the network we are trying to create. I hope this makes sense. Yeah, and I'll let Francesco continue.
One of the things that I think is important to repeat, maybe, is that the idea here is that the research question comes out of the interactions with others. So the typical model is one where researchers are asked, like I kind of did, but hopefully not with Sonia, to do the research and then prove to everybody that it has social impact, that it's policy, it will change the world, etc., very useful, etc. Here we're saying this doesn't work. So obviously a researcher should be driven by his or her own research interests. What we're saying here is there a way to put all people in the room to have just a frank, genuine, free conversation that then can influence the kind of question that is asked. So for me, the idea is to involve actors on a demand basis, right? So the idea of the network, including the social kind of network component that we think of developing with Ideas Belonging, is the fact that people would be attracted to the interest in the issues, would go on the network to find others interested in the same issue. In a way, this can have formats which are completely open, like kind of social media, or can be like handpicked, if you like, building a partnership with different actors. And these people need to be part of the conversation. And this forces the conversation to move from just research dissemination or research communication, that actually doesn't work, to like co-creation of projects. So again, this is all working process. This is the vision. But we know now, after this, a few points that we need to focus on in terms of technique, the technology that we need to have these interactions work. I don't know if I was any.
And if I can just react on that, and on one of the points you mentioned in your question, which I think is very important, is the issue of incentives. Because in the end, that's really one of the challenge there, is that we are trying to get different stakeholders around the same table who don't react to the same incentives. The incentives that researchers seek, the incentives that NGOs seek, the incentives that policymakers seek are fundamentally different. And in fact, negotiating within a community what are the expectations of individual actors is also one of the key points that we really want to work on, and that we saw was not sufficiently there here. We had the right incentives to get the engagement of international researchers, international organizations, policymakers. They liked the idea, they wanted to be part of it. But we didn't get incentive rights for the research because they don't want the same incentives.
Do we still have 1 minute? I just wanted to make an example.
Yeah, I have a question
okay.
to what you last said about incentives. From the paper, what I understood was that the incentives you largely see is the way the funding processes would go, right? And that's the incentives that you see as motivators for getting active involvement. Yeah. Now, I would wonder whether it's motivation that you're talking about, or do you see the funding as enabling certain research? See, there are two different ways in which that monetary funding can go into this process. And why I ask it is because in something like natural capital accounting, one can see that it is about, is your heart with the environmental agenda or not? That's really the crux of where motivation will come from. Otherwise, the national accounting people, as we see them in South Asia certainly, would tick the boxes and say, yes, it's done. But it's not what would actually serve the purpose for which it's required. So how do you get people who have their heart in it? And thereby, would it be more relevant to place the funding as enablers and not as the motivations or the incentives? Incentives really coming from what in transdisciplinary research is called boundary objects. For example, what you said about health and environment, that you actually set up where a group of people got interested in doing that draft. And therefore they got involved, not because there was money behind it. So how do you use more boundary objects, especially where interest is either flagging or movers are not really coming in?
Of course.
Maybe the processes.
I mean, in terms of the monetary incentive is just a pain on one, and frankly, it might work for some people. But definitely, policymakers are not interested in the money. Some researchers might be just because it enables them to do the research. NGOs are not necessarily interested in the money because the money will go into the research. So I think what is key is and the incentives are pre-existing as well, in a sense. Everybody goes into the project with their own motivation, their own vision of what they can get out of it. An example that was made to us, for example, the situation of water in Fiji. So Fiji exports bottled mineral water to North America. Now, it sounds like an extremely risky idea for an island in the middle of the Pacific to sell its fresh mineral underground water to North American customers, right? And the government has no data on how much water there is and how fast the reserves are going down. I mean, this is a fact. Yeah? So now, natural capital accounting could tell you that. It could tell you the stocks and the flow, right? but that doesn't tell you anything. You need to then link that to the question of how many people are employed in the industry. The policymaker likes it because it's a great export. You know, there's bottles with Fiji water everywhere in North America. Amazing, you know, because of visibility, etc. The NGOs might be interested in employment issues, or might be interested in the protection of the environment. Researchers might be interested in the social value of water, and the cultural kind of aspects of water management, etc. So in the end, you need these people, if you manage to get these people around the table and agree on a project that could help everybody, you know, this is the idea, and this is why moderation is key, because you need to engage with each person based on this person's own incentives and motivation. We need to accept that they'll have their own reason to be there, and money is just what enables the project to actually be done once it's defined, but it's a very, as you say, it's enabling more than anything else.
I think we're out of time.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, yes, but it's a really interesting discussion. But we've got Ritu next, and maybe she can link to this discussion about the policymakers and the motivations. So I'd like to introduce Ritu Priya. She's professor at the Center of Social Medicine and Community Health at JNU University in India. And she's approaching knowledge production and development from a health system lens, and explores ways to shift research agenda from developmentalism, what Sonia has also outlined very well, to a politics of knowledge framework. So we're interested to hear more about that. Thank you.
Thanks to EADI and to Suzanne and Julia for having me here. Came in as very late into the session, and so I'm happy to be here. I'm really following from their presentation, because what I'll be talking about is another attempt at trying to bring groups together and get different voices to come into the policy frame. We started by looking as a group interested in health systems at the crisis that healthcare is in today and recognized globally. It's largely unaffordable, even for the biggest economies of the world. If we look at it from the sustainability end, inequities and inequalities in health indicators, in the fact that WHO tells us that 50% of the population cannot afford access to healthcare today across the world, and so on. And thirdly, the negative impacts of the present medical model on the environment in terms of the pharmaceutical industry and what it's doing to the environment, to mercury, and so on and so forth. We can give a whole list of those. So there is a crisis in healthcare. And how do we look at it from a health systems perspective? Looking at the whole bag of ideas and perspectives that have been there, historically, we felt that primary health care of 1978, articulated by the Alma-Ata Declaration, offered some kind of solutions. But clearly there were differences from that time 40 years ago, and in terms of the nature of problems changing to non-communicable diseases and so on, the whole discourse environment, the larger political economy of healthcare and of other determinants of health changing, etc., etc., and the fact that now there was the whole discourse and the slogan had changed from primary healthcare to universal health coverage. And while this is, by some people, projected as being the same thing, because they sound similar, health for all and universal health coverage, they actually seem to have very different content. And the content has got reduced from all the determinants of health and the centrality of communities and people to universal health coverage, which meant how to make an unaffordable medical system affordable through insurance. And therefore the whole focus being how to get medical care out there. Yeah? And we've thought that that is what is making it unaffordable, ignoring the iatrogenesis or the negative effects that happen and so on, and therefore generate a discussion on how to revive the idea of primary health care back on and say, can universal health coverage actually take on the idea of primary health care and put the two together. About 2.5 years ago, 2016, we started and saying, recognizing that the environment has changed and the conditions have changed, we thought it needed a very large discussion and involving a large number of actors in this process. But we wanted to begin very sort of tentatively, and we started with doing workshops, invited workshops on the net for doing this kind of a discussion. And we got a group of young public health and health system researchers or students, some media persons, social activists, health activists, together. And when I say we, it's a group of 5 or 6 of us who are social scientists, health analysts, as well as health activists coming together. And so we had about a group of 30 like this, doing this discussion on these issues. Moved to, and over the next year we recognized that many people here were not really wanting to look back 40 years ago. And why do you want to look at a document that's 40 years old? But are looking at future and futuristic agendas. So we sort of use this primary healthcare document of 1978 as a boundary object, that is what generated the discussion. It provided us 50 pages of something written down concretely, signed up by 134 governments across the world, and so on. And yet having had limited actual implementation of that. And therefore, what were the barriers and how could it be used again further? So we had about after 10 months another such workshop, and we had modified it from this workshop and 30 people almost living together for 5 days, and the second one for 7 days with field visits and so on. So it was an intensive exercise. We've also used other kind of fora to bring in other elements. For example, there's been a series of efforts at looking at alternatives in different spheres, but also in health. And we helped organize a health Vikalp Sangam, as it's called in India. Vikalp meaning alternative, and Sangam is a conference. So conference of alternatives. Looking at what we thought was the other dimension and the other stream of thought that was there in public health, where you've got a whole area of what in the Western this thing is called complementary and alternative medicine, but all forms of traditional medicine that exist. The WHO itself bringing out every 4 or 5 years a policy on traditional medicine, so it's recognized in the international medical establishment, and yet it does not inform, even to a word, the whole health system's thinking on universal health coverage. And therefore, how do we bring these two streams together, which show very different kind of epistemological spaces, and can they inform each other and thereby enrich the whole rollout of UHC itself? And then we find that SDGs, as they come in 2015-16, actually adopt UHC as the model, which says nothing about primary health care. So that was another sort of impetus for us to take it forward. Through these exercises, what got recognized was that the medical industrial complex, which has been pushing the way the medical and the healthcare system has gone, has completely ensured that the knowledge space did not acknowledge these other epistemologies at all. And therefore, the UHC discourse certainly does not give them space. People have tried and it's not been given space, and therefore there was enough evidence of that. So in the Vikalp Sangam, we had practitioners of various forms of traditional medicine. In India, we have 8 forms which are recognized by the government. So we had some practitioners from there. We had folk healers who don't have any formal recognition but are very much there in the community.